Nikki, is it okay for us to start? You're on mute.
Thank you. Sorry, I was just stopping the break time slides and getting the next ones ready.
No
Thank you.
problem. Hello, everyone, and thank you for being with us today. It is with great pleasure for me to introduce my colleague, Dr. Nicola Latimer, also known as the lovely face of our CRELLA online seminars, and the one who has been beautifully facilitating our annual lecture today. Thank you so much, Nikki. Nikki is a research fellow here at CRELLA, where she also completed her PhD using eye tracking to investigate students' reading processes in academic reading into writing tasks. She has worked in English language teaching and assessment for over 20 years, first as a teacher, then as a teacher trainer, and now as a researcher. Nikki's research interests center on reading, writing, and how we can better accommodate and meet the needs of neurodiverse learners and test takers. She's also a member of the steering committee for UCALTA, the UK Association for Language Testing and Assessment, and also serves on the ILTA EDI working group, ILTA International Language Testing Association. Today, Nikki will be talking to us about applying lessons from second language test validity frameworks to tests of English as a first language. Over to you, Nikki, to take us through our talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay. Right, let's just share my slides with you. Okay, so I'm hoping you can all see my slides here now. So I'm going to tell you about a project that we did in conjunction with colleagues from OCR, looking at first language assessment and whether it was possible, and this was kind of an exploratory study, to see whether the type of frameworks that we use for first language assessment could be for second language assessment could be applied to first language assessment. So to talk a little bit about the kind of background and the context, we regularly use the socio-cognitive framework, that was developed by WEIR in 2005, and is constantly evolving and being adapted by the team at CRELLA. And as many of you will know, there are kind of different areas that we consider in the socio-cognitive framework, so test taker characteristics, context validity, cognitive validity, scoring validity, consequential validity, and criterion-related validity, as well as kind of the characteristics of the test taker themselves. And it gives us an evidence-based practical methodology to look at the construct that's being tested and to compare proficiency, language proficiency for tests in different circumstances. For this project, we really focused on both the context and the cognitive validity. So in terms of the context, we looked at sort of the response method, and this included for this where we were looking at GCSE in English language, the things like the text length, the text features, the discourse mode. I'll talk more about these things as we go through, and also the cognitive validity, so the types of reading that were demanded as the test takers took this test. So, as I said, this was the OCR GCSE in English language, and we looked at just 3 versions of the exam. Each exam has 2 papers. So there's a communicating information and ideas paper and an exploring effects and impact paper. And for each of those papers, the candidates are given 2 texts. Okay. And these texts are both unseen. That doesn't mean that they may never have come across them before. They're taken from literature, but the students don't know in advance what texts, what books will be used. It could be any book. And the two texts are thematically or kind of conceptually linked in some way. And some of the questions target both texts, require the students to talk about both the texts, and some questions could target just a single text. So I'll give you a quick overview of the methodology that we used for this. So as you can imagine, we had those 3 papers, which meant those 3 exams with 2 papers in each. So altogether, we had 12 texts and 6 sets of questions. And we used, for each of those papers, we used a variety of measures. So the first was textual analysis measures, and the texts were analysed using various textual analysis tools, which I'll talk about in a moment, to rate the readability and measure some of the textual characteristics of the text. So things like the frequency and richness and diversity of vocabulary, rates of meta discourse or markers. We then also had an expert panel, and we used expert judgment using Likert scales to rate the characteristics of the text. So that's things like how specialised the content matter of the text was, how culturally specific the texts were, how concrete or abstract the content matter was, and how explicit or implicit the organisation of the text was. We also then looked at the questions, so the 6 sets of questions were rated, and we considered things like the social and cultural knowledge needed to answer the questions. We also looked at the reading processes that would be demanded by the questions. Sorry, I've missed the last one there. No, sorry, I haven't. And the reading process is demanded by the questions. And I'll explain a little bit more in a little bit more detail now about each of these things. So in terms of textual analysis and readability, we considered basic measures such as things like type token ratios, but we also used a wide range of other readability formulas. We used a range because none are perfect. Some of the most commonly used measures of text readability are heavily affected by things like sentence length. And for example, in some of these cases, the text had been selected for some of their structural qualities. An aspect of the exam asked students to comment on, when they're reading, about the effect of things like structure, sentence length, things like that. And so some of these texts had been deliberately chosen because they had perhaps unusual structural qualities. For example, a series of very short sentences. Which were used to create dramatic effect. And that is maybe likely to distort some of these measures that are typically used there. So we used quite a wide range of measures, and some of those more sophisticated formulas. We used 7 altogether. And some of the most recently used ones, which take a wide range of factors into account. We also used a range of vocabulary measures to profile the texts. And we also used structural measures, so things like sentence length, average syllable counts per word, sentence length, etc. We also considered the social and contextual understanding that might be needed. So we took factors which are considered in areas like critical discourse analysis and pragmatics. So the sort of things we considered were understanding language as action and social practice. So understanding the perspectives, the characters or the authors and how that will have impacted the language used. Reading beyond the sentence level and thinking about the writer's meaning versus what has actually been said, particularly when characters are speaking in the texts, and understanding the intentions and the author's intended effect. So if you like, looking at inferring invisible meaning, inferring things that are not explicitly stated. And in order to do that, what we did with the expert panel was we gave the experts panel a series of questions. And some of those questions we asked them to consider in relation to the texts, and some of those we asked them to reflect on in relation to each of the questions. In terms of the reading processes, when we were looking at reading processes, we used Khalifa and Weir's model of reading, which is some of you may be familiar with, some of you may not, but it's quite widely used in certainly when we're looking at tests of English as a second language. And we considered as a panel, when we looked at each question, we considered the cognitive processes, the reading processes that the test takers were likely to engage in. So here you can see I've just highlighted what are effectively perceptual processes in reading. So maybe just establishing literal meaning at sentence level, where perhaps some of the questions don't require any inferencing, as compared to if we go right up through these levels, inferencing, them sort of building, if you like, a broader understanding of the text, right through to creating an intertextual representation, i.e. thinking about how two texts relate or differ to each other. We also looked at the type of reading that the students would have to do in order to answer that question. So it might be that, for example, they just had to read a small part of the text very carefully, going through, able to look at that sentence, read it in a very systematic way, and just arrive at a full understanding of a sentence locally. It might be that they're required to read the whole text and understand the whole thing, having read it all carefully. And also whether they were expected to do any expeditious reading, i.e. scanning to find specific information, or maybe scanning to find, searching for relevant ideas, which might be spread out across the text. So these were the sorts of things that we considered when we were looking at the questions and seeing what type of reading were demanded from candidates when they were answering those questions. So in effect, what we did on the day of the expert panel, we all individually made judgments about the reading texts. We looked at the text characteristics and rated them on a scale. We each reviewed the social context of the text. And then in terms of the questions, we then looked at each of the questions that were asked about the text and considered the type of reading that we felt they demanded, and rated that. We also made judgments about the reading processes, so to what extent that full range of reading processes were demanded by the questions. And we reviewed the social and contextual factors that might come into play for each of those questions. And then we had group discussions, which we recorded, and in order to reach a consensus. And both those, in analysing the data, I've looked at both the individual and the group judgments. And that was repeated for each of the papers. So to go through some of the results with you, this is an example of some of the textual analysis. So we had too many to go through them all here, but they were fairly consistent overall in terms of things like the vocabulary profile. So here you can see in the left hand the results of the the exploring effects and impacts paper on the left, and the communicating information ideas paper on the right. And you can see that they had quite broadly similar profiles in terms of the range of vocabulary that was used. In terms of readability, this was more difficult to score because we use several different measures of readability, and some of those report, if you like, a grade level, so at what stage, what school year, if you like, they're rating it to, and others use other scales. So what we did, we compared all those results, we amalgamated all those results using Z scores. So effectively what we did was you generate a standardized score, looking at the standard deviation for the set of data and looking at how many standard deviations away from the mean each one sits. And this allows you then to effectively amalgamate a number of scores on different scales and to give you some kind of overall rating for each of those. So the Z scores were added up and given a readability score. So there's quite a range, but as you can see, these so listed here are the texts that were rated, and you can see here that one came out at the top as the most difficult. There's one here at the easiest at the bottom, which was rated considerably easier to read than some of the other texts. However, it's not the text just in isolation. We also need to consider what the questions that were asked about those texts. So when looking, but what we also did as well, because there were two texts on each paper, we combined the scores for the paper, the two texts on each paper. So you can see here you've got the name of now of two texts, and that kind of did, if you like, reduce the range, but you can still see that there is quite a range there with the different papers. And you can see you've got the communicating papers are in orange and the exploring effects papers are in blue. When we looked at, as a panel, we looked at the text characteristics. So here you can see some of the characteristics that we considered. So how specialist the content was, how culturally specific the content of the text was, how concrete or abstract the nature of the information that the text wrote about was, and the organisation, how explicit or implicit and we rated those. And an average score there is likely to indicate lower. A lower score is likely to indicate a paper that is easier to read and comprehend. And you can see here that they're kind of in pairs. So the these two texts appear together on a single exam paper. And so we combined the scores so that we could look. And you can see that actually across those, there was actually a great deal of consistency across the papers in terms of those text characteristics. When we looked at the results of the rating process, of the types of reading that we felt students would have to engage in during the exam, we found that all of the papers across the questions demanded all the different types of reading. So they demanded both careful and expeditious reading at both global and local level. But it was quite evident that the low scoring questions tended to demand local forms of reading, with the higher scoring questions tending to demand the full range of reading processes. So it was likely that on questions where there were more marks were assigned, instead of perhaps just having to do some careful local reading, they were likely to have to engage in all these different types of reading. When we looked at the results in terms of the reading processes, we found that when we considered all of the questions, that across the questions on any particular paper, that the full range of reading processes was demanded. And that for me was something that I was extremely pleased to see. This idea of creating an intertextual representation, of having to look at multiple documents and compare the ideas that are contained in them and think about how they relate to each other. This is really the most challenging thing that we're called to do. And it's certainly something that is needed in higher education, something that is demanded in academic settings extensively. So I was pleased to see that. And it was also pleasing to see that in terms of score weighting, those questions that carried more marks, that scored more highly, very much demanded reading at this this most demanding level of cognitive processing. So I think that was something that's a good sign in terms of preparing the students that were taking this exam for the demands of further education after their GCSEs. In terms of the expert panel discussions, we did some thematic analysis of these, and we looked at the social and contextual factors that emerged. And to answer the questions well, the panel concluded that the students would have to understand things like social standings, social class, and social hierarchies, social capital, social relationships, that they would need to be able to interpret actions as an emotional response to situations. They had to imagine and predict the emotional response of other people to situations, and had to be aware of changing social attitudes over time, most from a historic perspective. On some papers, questions asked about these issues explicitly or directly. On others, there wasn't an explicit question about these, but we felt that it was felt that the readers would need that knowledge in order to help them interpret the text, and it would be of assistance to them in answering the questions. I have examples of all of those, but I think if we have questions about that, we may come back to it. But I think otherwise, in terms of time, I may run out if I go into that now. So other things that we noted around the social and contextual factors were that there were differing amounts. It did very much depend on the text, and some papers demanded, if you like, different amounts and different levels of historical or cultural background knowledge. There was very good practice in that each of the texts did have some contextual information and was given to candidates before they read the texts. But there was quite a bit of variability in the amount of contextual information that was given. Sometimes it was a single sentence, sometimes it was up to 4 sentences. And the communicating ideas papers tended to require candidates to interpret social situations and social dynamics of the text. And the exploring effects paper tended to require candidates to interpret the characters' emotional responses to situations or to other characters. So in terms of conclusions and recommendations. So the text showed good consistency in terms of the range and the frequency of the vocabulary, but the measures of readability were a bit less consistent, and particularly on those exploring ideas papers. There was good consistency of the textual characteristics, especially when the results for the 2 different texts on any one paper were combined. All of the papers demanded the full range of reading processes and all 4 different types of reading. As I said, it was good to see that there were more marks. Certainly the way that the papers were marked, it was very heavily in favour of giving more marks to questions that demanded these higher level global processes. There were a range of social and contextual factors were needed in order to interpret texts. And some papers, these were explicitly mentioned, in others less so. But there was this good practice of giving information to contextualize the texts before the candidates went to read the texts. Overall, we felt that the framework, and this is a framework that we've used for second tests of English as second language, we felt it was, as I said at the beginning, really an exploratory study to see whether it would work. And we felt that generally the framework and the process adapted well for L1 contexts. In terms of recommendations, I think one of the most important ones is that role of cultural and historic knowledge, that sort of background knowledge that the readers bring to a text when they're reading. There's evidence that certainly some readers with English as a second language, having good background and knowledge around the text can really help them, can help sometimes compensate for lower skills, other language skills, as it were. And that could suggest that for students who have English as an additional language, and that is 20% of students currently, well, in 2023, 20% of students in England were listed as having English as an additional language. That doesn't mean to say that those students are not proficient in English. That is not the same thing. It's not an indication of their proficiency. But it does mean that for those students, if using background knowledge is helpful in the exam, we have to consider whether everybody is being has access to the same range of historical and cultural knowledge, and the role that plays within any exam to ensure that certain groups aren't disadvantaged. Maybe as well, one way is looking at those varying amounts of contextual information that's given. Research around that, comparing the effect on stronger and weaker readers, because there is research out there that the more background information you have, the more you understand about the context that you're reading, the easier it is to read and understand that. The differing focus, a slight difference in focus between the two types of papers. That was just in a very small sample, but maybe that's something that is typical or deliberate, and it's more widespread. It may be of benefit for test takers if those differences are made very explicit to them. And I'm not sure whether that's something that happens. I couldn't see anything in the in the specifications, but that's something that maybe teachers are aware of, but I think that needs consideration. And research out there suggests that there are differences in the way reading materials are processed by readers with autism. And that is not to take that evidence does not suggest that readers with autism do not engage or are not capable of engaging with texts that are about social interaction or people's emotions. In fact, quite opposite to that, the work by Chappell and colleagues suggested that students with autism actually, and these were adults rather than young people, but it actually showed that they engaged very much with it, that they interacted with it. But it also took them slightly longer, perhaps because they were engaging with it in a more detailed way, that it may be that there needs to be some discussion around accommodations if that's the case. There's also work by Drysdale and colleagues who used eye tracking, which suggested that, again, readers with autism had longer fixation time, so effectively slower reading. No differences in comprehension of these of the text, but that perhaps their reading processes differ slightly. So that's perhaps something that needs to be considered. There are some limitations here. So it was an exploratory study. It was the first time we've tried it. It was a small sample of papers. And we had a small number of people on the panel, and because we were running out of time as we were running it, not all of the papers were rated by everybody, so we split into two groups for part of the session. And as yet, these are initial findings. The social contextual findings do require second coding at this point, and these are my references. So thank you very much, and I hope I haven't run too much over time. I think I've just about managed. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Nikki.